There is a list of things most people have decided, quietly and without announcement, never to think about seriously. Not because they are unimportant, quite the opposite. Because they are so large, so permanent, so immune to solution, that sustained attention to them feels like staring directly into something unbearable. You know the list. You have your version of it. The fact that you will die and do not know when. The fact that you are more free than you have admitted to yourself, which means more responsible. The fact that no one, not a single person on earth, can fully enter your experience, that at some fundamental level, you are alone, in a way that connection can ease but never dissolve. And the fact that the universe offers no predetermined answer to the question of whether any of this means anything. Irvin Yalom was an American psychiatrist who spent 50 years sitting with people in exactly the pain produced by these four things. Not the pain of having thought about them, but the pain of having spent a lifetime trying not to. He called them the four givens of existence. And his central argument, which runs through everything he wrote and everything he practiced, is this: the attempt to avoid these four facts does not protect us from them, it simply hands them control. What we refuse to look at runs us. Yalom was born in Washington, D.C. in 1931, the son of Russian Jewish immigrants who ran a small grocery store. His parents worked constantly. The neighborhood was rough. He spent his childhood reading books he borrowed from the library, escaping, as he later described it, into the lives of people more interesting than the ones immediately available to him. He became a psychiatrist, trained at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, and spent most of his career at Stanford. Over 5 decades, he worked with patients who came to him with depression, anxiety, relationship failures, career collapses, terminal diagnoses. And what he noticed, what became the organizing insight of his life's work, is that beneath the surface presenting problem, almost always, was one of 4 things. Not always consciously, not always articulately, but always there. The anxiety of death, the anxiety of freedom, the anxiety of existential isolation, the anxiety of meaninglessness. He called these the ultimate concerns of existence, a phrase he borrowed, with credit, from the philosopher Paul Tillich, whose work we have explored in a previous video. Yalom's contribution was not to discover these concerns. They had been named by philosophers for centuries. His contribution was to bring them into the consulting room to show how they manifest in ordinary human suffering, in the specific patterns of avoidance that people construct to stay away from them, and in the specific liberation that becomes possible when those patterns are examined honestly. The 4 givens are not a problem to be solved. They are conditions to be faced, and Yalom spent his career documenting, with extraordinary specificity, what changes when people finally face them. Death is where Yalom begins, and it is where most people stop. Not because death is the most important of the 4 givens, though a case can be made for that, but because it is the most final and the most systematically avoided. Modern culture has developed an extraordinary apparatus for keeping death out of view. We have removed it from homes and put it in hospitals. We have replaced the language of dying with the language of passing. We schedule it with the tidiness of appointments, and then, as quickly as possible, return to normal. Yalom observed that this is not a failure of courage. It is a rational response to something genuinely terrifying. Ernest Becker, whose work Yalom engaged extensively, argued in The Denial of Death that the awareness of mortality is so threatening to the human organism that virtually all of human civilization, religion, culture, achievement, love, can be understood as elaborate strategies for managing death anxiety. We build things that will outlast us. We attach ourselves to groups and ideologies that will continue when we are gone. We have children. We create art. We seek fame. All of this, Becker argued, is in some measure the attempt to secure a symbolic immortality against the knowledge that the biological kind is not available. Yalom did not entirely disagree. But he added something crucial. Death anxiety, he observed, operates not only as a background driver of grand civilizational projects, it operates in the most ordinary moments of a person's life, shaping decisions they do not recognize as death-related at all. The person who cannot commit to a relationship because commitment means the end of other possibilities and endings, however small, carry the flavor of finality. The person who cannot finish a project because finishing means it is over, and they cannot bear for things to be over. The person who avoids genuine closeness because closeness means there will eventually be loss. The person who keeps themselves so busy that the question of what the busyness is for never quite has time to surface. These are not obviously about death, but in Yalom's consulting room, they often traced back to it. His clinical practice produced a counterintuitive observation that he wrote about extensively. The confrontation with death when it actually happened. When a patient received a terminal diagnosis or lost someone central to their life, often produced not collapse, but a strange kind of clarification. People described prioritizing differently, dropping grievances that had consumed years, initiating conversations they had postponed, doing things they had always intended to do and had never quite begun. The awareness of death, Yalom concluded, does not reduce the quality of life. The denial of it does. He called this the awakening experience, the moment when the anesthetic of ordinary preoccupation wears off and a person sees their life with sudden and unusual clarity. Most people, he observed, wait for a crisis to provide this clarity. The terminal diagnosis, the accident, the loss. But Yalom argued, and this was the practical heart of his work, that the clarity available after a crisis is available before it, if you are willing to look in the right direction. The question he returned to again and again, both in therapy and in his own life, was this: if you knew, not abstractly, but specifically and viscerally, that your life is finite, not someday, but genuinely limited, genuinely running, what would you do differently? Not as an exercise in morbidity, as an act of orientation. Death, Yalom argued, is the condition that makes life urgent. It is not the enemy of meaning. It is, properly understood, its most reliable source. Freedom is the second given, and it is the one that causes the most confusion when it appears on this list. We tend to associate freedom with relief, with doors opening, constraints dissolving, options multiplying. In ordinary usage, more freedom is almost always understood as better. The existential meaning of freedom is different, and it points in the opposite direction. When Yalom speaks of freedom as an ultimate concern, he means something specific: the recognition that you are the author of your own life, that there is no external structure that assigns you your purpose, your values, your choices, your character. That you have, in the existential sense, made yourself and continue, in each moment, to make yourself, and that this authorship is yours alone, whether or not you have claimed it. The anxiety this produces is not the anxiety of too many choices. It is the anxiety of responsibility. If you are the author of your life, then you are the author of its failures as well as its successes. You cannot, in good faith, attribute the life you are living entirely to your circumstances, your upbringing, your relationships, your luck. These shaped you. But at some point, at many points, you chose, and you continue to choose. Yalom called the avoidance of this recognition compulsive responsibility shifting, the person who explains their unhappiness entirely through other people's behavior. The person who says they would live differently if only their circumstances were different, without examining what they would need to do to change their circumstances. The person who attributes their choices to fate, to obligation, to necessity, to anything external that relieves them of the weight of authorship, he also observed a more subtle form. The person who avoids making genuine choices by making no choice at all, who drifts, who keeps options open not because they are genuinely undecided, but because deciding means committing, and committing means being responsible for the outcome. If this is landing, if the specific quality of Yalom's diagnosis feels like something you have been living inside without quite naming it, this channel exists for exactly this kind of honest examination. Subscribe to The Lucid Mind, not as a habit, but because these conversations are worth having. And if you have something to say about which of the four givens is hardest for you to face, the comments section is open. I read everything. Here is what makes Yalom's treatment of freedom distinct from the ordinary self-help version of the same insight. He does not say, "Take responsibility for your life." He says, "Become aware of the ways you are already avoiding it." The project is not motivational. It is investigative. The question is not, "Why aren't you living your life more deliberately?" It is, "What specific mechanisms are you using right now to avoid the recognition that you could?" The answer, in his clinical experience, almost always involves some version of what he called the ultimate rescuer fantasy, the belief, usually unconscious, that something or someone will eventually appear to take care of the fundamental problem, the relationship that will finally provide security, the achievement that will finally resolve the feeling of inadequacy. The moment when the sense of purpose will arrive, fully formed, without having to be constructed, the parent, partner, therapist, or belief system that will make the deep decisions unnecessary. This fantasy is so common and so seductive precisely because it offers relief from the heaviness of freedom. If someone else is in charge, if the universe has a plan, if the right person will eventually appear, if circumstances will eventually arrange themselves, then the weight of authorship is not entirely yours. But Yalom observed that this relief is temporary and costly. The person who does not claim authorship of their life does not thereby escape the consequences of their choices. They simply lose the ability to make those choices consciously. They are still authoring, they just cannot see that they are. Freedom, in the existential sense, is not comfortable. It is the recognition that you are, to a degree that most people prefer not to contemplate, responsible for who you have become and who you will become. Yalom's therapy was not about adding more freedom to a person's life. It was about helping them see the freedom they already had and had been avoiding. Existential isolation is the third given, and it is the one most likely to be misunderstood because it sounds like loneliness, and it is not quite that. Yalom was careful to distinguish three forms of isolation. Interpersonal isolation is what most people mean when they speak of loneliness, the felt absence of connection with other people. Intrapersonal isolation is the disconnection from one's own inner life, the split between what a person actually feels and what they allow themselves to know they feel. And existential isolation is something more fundamental than either, the unbridgeable gap between any individual's inner experience and anyone else's. Even in the deepest relationship, even in the most genuine love, even in the moments of most complete communion, you cannot fully enter another person's experience, and they cannot fully enter yours. The skin of the body is a barrier that no intimacy dissolves. You were born alone in the sense that matters here, alone in being this particular organism, having this particular experience, confronting the particular conditions of your existence, and you will die that way. This sounds stark, and it is, but Yalom was not describing a tragedy to be mourned. He was describing a condition to be recognized, because the recognition opens something important. He observed that much of what people pursue in relationships is the fantasy of merging, of finding a connection so complete that the existential isolation dissolves. The person who cannot be alone. The relationship organized around being needed rather than genuinely caring. The love that is really a demand. Be with me completely. Validate my existence completely. Make me feel, at last, that I am not alone in the way that matters most. The problem with this fantasy, and Yalom saw its wreckage constantly, is that it cannot be satisfied by any actual relationship. Because what it is asking for is the dissolution of something that is, by nature, indissoluble. And when the relationship fails to produce that dissolution, when the partner remains, despite everything, a separate person with their own separate interior, the result is not only disappointment, but a specific kind of rage. The rage of someone who was promised something that could not be given. The alternative Yalom describes is not stoic acceptance of isolation. It is something more productive. The recognition that genuine connection does not dissolve the gap it traverses it. Two people, each genuinely alone in the existential sense, choosing to reach toward each other across the gap. This is different from the merger fantasy. It requires that each person be fully present as a separate individual, not dissolved into the relationship, but genuinely there, in it, as themselves. He also observed something that surprised many of his patients, that the acknowledgement of existential isolation can produce, paradoxically, a deepening of connection. When two people can be honest about the fundamental aloneness of their experience, when they can sit together with the recognition that this is what existence is, they often find a closeness that the merger fantasy, with all its intensity, never actually provides. The capacity to be genuinely alone, to be with oneself, in the existential sense, without fleeing into distraction or dependency, is, in Yalom's view, not a sign of isolation. It is a prerequisite for genuine intimacy. You cannot truly reach toward another person if you cannot stand on your own ground. The fourth given is meaninglessness, and it is the one that the 21st century has made most acute. Yalom's position on meaning is the most misunderstood of all four givens, so it is worth being precise. He did not argue that life is meaningless. He argued that the universe does not supply meaning, that there is no external, predetermined answer to the question of what your life is for. This is not nihilism. It is the starting point for something more interesting. The anxiety of meaninglessness arises when a person becomes aware that the meaning they have been living by the values they inherited, the goals they pursued, the framework through which they organize their choices is a human construction rather than a cosmic given, that it could have been different, that it is, in a fundamental sense, chosen rather than discovered. For many people, this recognition is destabilizing. If meaning is constructed rather than given, then the meaning they have been living by is not guaranteed. It can be questioned. It can be found inadequate. It can collapse under the weight of examination. Yalom observed that the avoidance of this recognition takes two characteristic forms. The first is what he called immersion, filling life so completely with activity, consumption, entertainment, productivity, and busyness that the question of what it is all for never quite surfaces. The second is dogmatism, adopting a framework, religious, political, ideological, that provides predetermined meaning, so complete and so total that no examination is possible. Both strategies work in the short term. Both are ultimately costly because both require the suppression of the very capacity for self-examination that Yalom considered the foundation of genuine psychological health. His alternative is not to resolve the problem of meaning. It is to engage it, to ask, with genuine seriousness, what do I actually value? Not what should I value, not what am I supposed to value, But what when I examine my own experience honestly actually matters to me? What, when I do it, produces in me the specific quality of engagement that Yalom associated with living fully? He was influenced here by the existentialist tradition, particularly by Viktor Frankl, whose work on meaning we have explored in a previous video, but he diverged from Frankl in a significant way. Frankl tended to speak of meaning as something discovered, an objective value waiting to be found. Yalom was more skeptical. For him, meaning is created rather than discovered. The question is not what is the meaning of my life? It is what meaning will I construct and inhabit and be willing to live by? This is harder than it sounds. It requires a kind of courage that has no external guarantee. The meaning you construct may not be ratified by anyone else. It may not look impressive from the outside. It may not provide the kind of certainty that a received framework would offer, but it has something those frameworks do not. It is yours. It reflects what you actually, honestly, upon examination, care about. Yalom described patients who had lived for decades, according to values they had never examined the successful professional, who had never asked whether success was what they actually wanted. The devoted parent, who had never examined whether their devotion was genuinely felt or performed out of obligation. The deeply religious person, who had never sat with the question of what they actually believed. And he described what happened when those patients finally examined these things. The examination was uncomfortable. Sometimes it was devastating. But almost always, he observed, it was also clarifying in a way that nothing else had been. And the life that followed the examination, even when it looked, from the outside, very similar to the life before, had a quality of inhabitation that the previous life had lacked. The person was now living their values consciously, having chosen them, having tested them against their own experience. The meaning was no longer inherited, it was earned. Yalom did not regard the four givens as four separate problems. He regarded them as four facets of a single confrontation, the confrontation with the conditions of existence. Death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness are not independent anxieties. They interpenetrate. The awareness of death makes the question of meaning urgent. The recognition of freedom makes the responsibility for meaning inescapable. The acknowledgement of existential isolation clarifies that the meaning you construct must finally be your own. It cannot be borrowed from another person, even the person you love most. And the confrontation with meaninglessness returns you, eventually, to death. To the recognition that this limited span of time, with no guaranteed purpose, is all that is available. What Yalom found, over 50 years of clinical practice, is that people who have genuinely confronted these four things, not once, as a philosophical exercise, but repeatedly, as an ongoing orientation toward their own existence, tend to live differently, not more dramatically, not with more certainty, but with a quality of presence that he struggled to describe and never stopped trying to. He used the word engagement. The person who has faced the four givens is engaged with their life in a way that the person who avoids them is not. They are there, in the specific moment, in the specific relationship, in the specific choice. They are not waiting for conditions to improve, for the right moment to arrive, for the feeling to solidify before they commit. They are in it. This is not a comfortable state. Yalom was always honest about that. Genuine engagement with a finite, unguaranteed, fundamentally solitary existence is not comfortable. But it is, he argued, the alternative to a specific kind of suffering that he found far more common and far more costly, the suffering of people who had successfully avoided the four givens and found themselves, at some point, late in their lives, with the feeling that they had never quite arrived at their own existence. He called this the unlived life, and he found it, across 50 years of practice, to be the most common form of human pain. Yalom developed practical approaches, not techniques in the self-help sense, but specific invitations toward honest confrontation. For death awareness, he returned again and again to a simple practice: the regular, specific contemplation of your own finitude, not morbidly, not anxiously, but honestly. If you knew, not abstractly but in your body, in the way you know things that are about to happen, that your time was genuinely limited, what would you do with today that you are not doing? What would you stop doing? What would you begin? For freedom, the question is investigative rather than motivational. Not, what should I do with my life, but what am I doing right now to avoid claiming authorship of it? Where am I waiting for rescue? Where am I attributing to necessity what is actually choice? Where am I drifting because drifting feels safer than deciding? For isolation, the practice is what Yalom called genuine encounter. A single conversation today in which you are actually present as yourself, not performing, not managing the other person's impression of you, not half attending while the other part of you evaluates how you are coming across. A moment of actual contact between two people who are both genuinely there. And for meaninglessness, a question Yalom considered among the most important a person can ask themselves, not what is the meaning of my life, but what do I actually value when I am honest? What activities, when I am engaged in them, produce in me the sense of being most fully myself? What relationships, when I am in them, produce in me the sense of being most alive? What would I choose if I were choosing from my actual values rather than from what I have been told to value? These 4 questions are not meant to be answered once and filed away. They are meant to become part of the texture of how a person moves through their days, not as sources of anxiety, but as sources of orientation. Not as problems to solve, but as conditions to inhabit honestly. Yalom continued seeing patients into his 80s. He continued writing fiction and nonfiction until late in his life. And what his later writing circles back to, again and again, is not the 4 givens as theory, but the 4 givens as personal experience. As an old man, he faced what he had helped others face for 50 years. And he found, as he had always argued his patients would find, that looking directly at these things was less terrible than looking away from them. The confrontation with the 4 givens does not resolve them. Death remains death. Freedom remains the weight of authorship. Isolation remains the unbridgeable gap. Meaninglessness remains the condition of a universe that does not answer. But something changes in the relationship to these things when they are faced rather than avoided. The energy spent in avoidance becomes available for something else. The specific suffering of the person running from their existence lifts slightly, and in its place, the possibility of actually being in the life that is available. Irvin Yalom spent 50 years in a consulting room, and what he found there was not what he expected. He expected to find people suffering from the things they talked about: failed relationships, career disappointments, losses, conflicts, anxieties that seemed to have specific causes and specific remedies. He found those things, but underneath them, almost always, he found something more fundamental. People who were suffering in one way or another from the difficulty of existing, not from any specific misfortune, from the 4 conditions that are given to anyone who is alive: that they will die, that they are responsible for themselves, that they are finally alone in the particular way that matters most, and that the universe has not supplied the answer to the question of what it is all for. He did not find that facing these things made them easier. He found that facing them made the suffering they caused more honest, more rooted in reality, rather than in avoidance, and therefore, eventually, more workable. The unlived life is the most common form of human pain. It is the pain of someone who has been waiting to arrive at their own existence and who realizes, at some point, that the waiting has become the life. The alternative is not heroism. It is not a particular set of beliefs or practices or achievements. It is something simpler and harder than any of those. The willingness to look honestly and regularly at the four things most people have decided never to think about seriously, and to discover, as Yalom's patients often did, that the looking is survivable, that what is on the other side of the avoidance is not catastrophe, but clarity. And that clarity, even when it is uncomfortable, is the material from which a genuine life is made. Subscribe to the Lucid Mind. Think deeper. Live clearer.